There is a room inside your mind that you have never left. Its walls are invisible, its doors have no locks, yet you cannot find the exit. You have lived here so long that you no longer recognize it as a prison. The bars are made of thought, endless, spinning, relentless thought. And you, the prisoner, have become so identified with your jailer that you believe you are free. But listen, in the silence between your thoughts, in that infinitesimal gap that appears before the next mental noise floods in, there is a question waiting, a question that has haunted humanity since the first human being became self-aware enough to realize they were thinking at all. Why can't you stop? Picture this. It is 3 a.m. You lie in darkness, your body exhausted, desperate for sleep. But your mind is a theater of endless reruns. Yesterday's conversation plays again, with new dialogue you wish you'd said. Tomorrow's meeting rehearses itself, spinning through possible disasters. Old wounds resurface, dressed in new costumes but wearing the same face. Plans form and dissolve, worries multiply, memories intrude. The present moment, the only moment that actually exists, slips away unnoticed while you dance with phantoms in the corridors of your skull. You tell yourself to stop thinking. You command your mind to be still. And what happens? The thoughts intensify. They multiply. They laugh at your attempts to control them. Because here is the first paradox, the first thread we must pull to unravel this mystery. The attempt to stop thinking is itself a form of thinking. The controller and the controlled are the same entity, locked in an eternal civil war. This is not a disorder. This is not abnormal. This is the human condition in its most concentrated form. We are the only species on Earth cursed and blessed with the capacity to think about our thinking, to worry about our worrying, to fear our fear. We are trapped in what the psychologists call recursive self-awareness, the mind folding back upon itself like an Escher painting, creating infinite loops of analysis, judgment, and commentary. But tonight, or today, wherever you are in this turning world, we are going to do something dangerous. We are going to investigate this prison. We are going to trace the architecture of your mental captivity back to its origins. We are going to understand why thinking has become not a tool you use, but an addiction you cannot quit. And we are going to discover what lies on the other side of this compulsion, in that space that mystics call presence, that scientists call the flow state, that poets call grace. This is a journey into control and the illusion of control, into the ego's desperate attempt to survive by creating a simulation of reality it can manipulate, into the psychological mechanisms that keep you locked in an endless cycle of mental activity, convinced that if you just think hard enough, plan thoroughly enough, worry intensely enough, you can somehow make yourself safe in an uncertain world. The stakes could not be higher, because this addiction to thinking, this compulsive need for mental control, is not just making you anxious or exhausted. It is blocking you from the deepest experiences available to human consciousness. It is preventing you from actually living while you are busy planning, analyzing, and worrying about life. It is creating a second-hand existence where you experience everything through the filter of mental commentary rather than the raw immediacy of direct perception. Consider this. How much of your life have you missed while lost in thought? How many sunsets went unseen because you were rehearsing tomorrow? How many conversations did you not truly hear because you were preparing your next response? How many moments of potential joy, connection, or insight slipped past while your mind was elsewhere, cataloguing the past or predicting the future? The ancient Greeks had a word, nous, which meant the direct, intuitive apprehension of reality. Not thought about reality, but reality itself, unmediated and immediate. We have lost this capacity, or rather, we have buried it beneath layers of compulsive mental activity. We have confused the map for the territory, the menu for the meal, the description for the experience. But here is what you must understand before we go deeper. Your mind is not your enemy. Thinking is not the problem. The problem is the addiction to thinking, the compulsive, unconscious, continuous nature of it. The problem is that thinking has ceased to be a tool you pick up when needed and has become a constant background noise you can no longer turn off. The problem is that you have identified so completely with your thoughts that you believe you are your thoughts. You are not. And proving that to you, helping you experience even one moment of awareness without the prison of compulsive thought, is the secret purpose of everything we will explore together. So take a breath. Not a symbolic breath, but an actual breath. Feel the air entering your body. Notice how, for just that instant, the commentary stopped. The thinker paused. Something deeper than thought was present. That space, that gap, is where our journey begins. Let me tell you about a man I never met, who lived 1,000 miles away, whose name I will never know. He wrote to me 3 years ago, a confession more than a question. He said he had not experienced silence in his mind for over a decade. From the moment he woke until the moment he finally collapsed into sleep, his thoughts ran like a river in flood, chaotic and uncontrollable. He had tried meditation, medication, therapy, and distraction. Nothing worked. Or rather, everything worked momentarily. Then the thoughts would return, more insistent than before. What broke my heart about his letter was not the pain, it was the shame. He felt he was failing at being human. He believed that everyone else had mastered their minds, while his remained rebellious and wild. He thought he was uniquely broken. But he was not broken. He was just awake enough to notice what most people have learned to ignore. The mind, left to its own devices, never stops. It cannot stop. Because the mind, as we will discover, is an addiction machine, a control apparatus, a survival system that long ago exceeded its original programming and became something else entirely, a tyrant disguised as a protector. We have built civilizations, split atoms, mapped genomes, and reached for the stars, all powered by this extraordinary thinking machine between our ears. But we have not learned to turn it off. We have not learned to distinguish between useful thought and compulsive mental noise. We have not understood that the same mechanism that allows us to plan the future and learn from the past can become a prison when it never stops, when it hijacks every moment with its endless commentary and projection. The Buddha called this monkey mind, the restless, capricious, uncontrollable nature of thoughts swinging from branch to branch. Modern neuroscience calls it the default mode network, the brain's baseline state of self-referential thinking that activates whenever we are not focused on a specific task. The existentialists called it bad faith, the lies we tell ourselves to avoid confronting the raw truth of existence. Carl Jung called it the ego's inflation, the false self that believes its thoughts define reality. They are all describing the same prison, the same compulsion, the same addiction. And tonight, we escape. Not through force, not through more thinking about thinking, but through understanding, through seeing the mechanism so clearly that it loses its power, through recognizing that the prison guard is a phantom, that the walls are made of nothing more substantial than repeated patterns of neural firing, that freedom was always available, you just didn't know where to look. Are you ready? Because once you see what I'm about to show you, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand the architecture of your mental prison, you will start noticing the bars everywhere. In your conversations, your relationships, your quiet moments, your dreams. You will begin to recognize how much energy you spend maintaining this addiction to control and how much life you have sacrificed to its demands. But you will also discover something extraordinary. You are not your thoughts. You are the awareness that notices the thoughts. And that awareness, that spacious, silent consciousness that exists before and after every thought, is your true nature. It has always been there, patient and vast, waiting for you to turn your attention away from the noise and discover the quiet at the core of your being. This is not a metaphor. This is not poetry. This is the most practical, immediate, urgent truth about human consciousness. You are living in a prison of thought, and the key has been in your pocket the entire time. Let us begin. How the mind became a prison. To understand why you cannot stop thinking, we must travel back, not just to your childhood, though that is part of the story, not just to the dawn of human consciousness, though that too plays its role. We must go back to the fundamental architecture of the brain itself, to the moment when evolution created a creature that could think about its thinking, and in doing so trapped itself in a labyrinth of its own making. Imagine a human being 300,000 years ago standing on the African savanna as night falls. The shadows lengthen. In the distance, something rustles in the tall grass. Is it the wind? Or is it something that hunts? The humans who survived were not the calmest or most present. They were the ones whose minds never stopped scanning for danger, planning escape routes, replaying past encounters with predators, projecting possible futures. The anxious survived. The worriers survived. The ones who could not stop thinking. They were the ones who lived long enough to become your ancestors. Evolution designed your brain for survival, not for peace. It designed your mind to be a prediction machine, a threat detection system, a simulator of possible disasters. And it worked. Brilliantly. We conquered the planet. We climbed to the top of the food chain not through strength or speed, but through thought, through our ability to imagine what is not present, to plan for scenarios that have not yet occurred, to learn from experiences we have not personally had. But here is the cruel joke at the heart of the human condition. The traits that ensured our survival as a species are now destroying our peace as individuals. The same mental mechanisms that once kept us alive in the wilderness now keep us awake at 3 a.m, worrying about emails, replaying awkward conversations, imagining catastrophes that will probably never occur. The threat has changed, but the response has not. Your brain cannot tell the difference between a lion in the grass and a critical email from your boss. It activates the same ancient systems, flooding your body with cortisol, accelerating your heart, launching your mind into hyperactive analysis mode. And once activated, those systems do not easily turn off. Let me take you deeper into the mechanics. Inside your skull, there is a network of brain regions that neuroscientists call the default mode network, or DMN. This network includes the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the inferior parietal lobule. These regions light up on brain scans whenever you are not focused on a specific external task. In other words, whenever you are doing nothing, this network is doing everything. It is the DMN that generates the stream of consciousness, the internal monologue, the endless cascade of thoughts about yourself and your life. It is the neural signature of the wandering mind, the daydreaming brain, the self-referential narrator that never shuts up. And here is the crucial discovery. The default mode network is hyperactive in people with depression, anxiety, and addiction. Think about that. The baseline state of the human brain, the mode it defaults to when not otherwise engaged, is the same mode that characterizes psychological suffering. We are wired for mental suffering. It is our factory setting. But it gets more complex, more beautiful, and terrible at once. Within this default mode network, there is a particular node, the medial prefrontal cortex, that is associated with self-referential thinking. Every time you think about yourself, your past, your future, your identity, your problems, your dreams, this region activates. And the more it activates, the stronger the sense of self becomes. The ego, in neural terms, is a pattern of repeated activation in this region, reinforcing itself with every self-referential thought. The ego is not a thing. It is a process, a habit, a repetitive firing pattern that has become so automatic, so deeply grooved into your neural architecture that it feels like the most solid, unchangeable aspect of your existence. But it is not solid. It is a verb disguised as a noun, a flow of mental activity pretending to be a fixed entity. And this ego, this sense of being a separate self, requires constant thinking to maintain itself. Like a bicycle that must keep moving to stay upright, The ego must keep generating thoughts to continue existing. Stop thinking about yourself, and the sense of self begins to dissolve. This is why meditation is so difficult. This is why presence feels threatening, because every moment of thoughtless awareness is a moment in which the ego, the false identity you have spent your entire life constructing, begins to fade. The ego does not want to fade. It wants to survive, and its primary survival strategy is control. Now we arrive at the heart of the matter: control. That word contains the entire architecture of your psychological prison. Control is the ego's master strategy, its reason for being, its justification for the endless thinking that exhausts you. Listen to your thoughts for just 1 minute, and you will notice a pattern: planning, rehearsing, analyzing, worrying, remembering, predicting. What are all these activities but attempts to control? You replay the past, trying to understand it, to make sense of it, to extract lessons that will help you control the future. You rehearse conversations, trying to control how others perceive you. You worry about possible futures, trying to control outcomes through anticipation. You analyze yourself, trying to control who you are. The thinking never stops because the attempt to control never stops. And the attempt to control never stops because the ego believes, truly, desperately believes, that its survival depends on it. But here is what the ego will never tell you, because it cannot know this and survive. You cannot control reality. You never could. You never will. The only thing you can control is your relationship to reality, your response, your acceptance, your resistance. Everything else is an illusion, a comforting fiction that the ego maintains to justify its existence. Let me tell you an ancient story, one that every culture has told in different forms. There was once a king who had everything: wealth, power, respect, but he could not sleep. Every night he lay awake, his mind racing with thoughts of threats to his kingdom, plots against his throne, the inevitable approach of old age and death. He summoned wise men, physicians, priests. None could help him. Finally, an old mystic came to the palace. The king explained his torment. "I cannot stop my mind," he said. "It runs like a wild horse, dragging me behind it." The mystic smiled. "Your Majesty," he said, "you are trying to control a wild horse by running faster than it. This is your error." "Then what should I do?" the king demanded. "Stop running," the mystic said. "Let the horse tire itself out. It has been running for so long only because you have been running with it. The moment you stop, you will discover something remarkable. The horse was never real. It was a shadow cast by your fear," the king protested. "But my thoughts are real. My concerns are legitimate. The threats to my kingdom are real." "The threats may be real," the mystic replied, "but the thinking about them is not protecting you. It is only exhausting you. Action protects you. Presence protects you. Wisdom protects you. But anxious thought? That protects nothing. It only gives the illusion of control while stealing the life you are trying to protect." This is not ancient wisdom. This is modern neuroscience. Studies have shown that people who engage in excessive worry and rumination do not solve more problems or avoid more disasters. They simply experience more suffering. The correlation between thinking and control is far weaker than the ego would have you believe. Yet the addiction persists because it is not rational. It is not based on evidence. It is based on fear. Specifically, the fear of uncertainty. Human beings are uncertainty-intolerant machines. We are the only species that knows we will die, that our loved ones will die, that everything we build will eventually crumble. We live in a fundamentally uncertain universe, where the next moment is never guaranteed, where control is always partial and temporary at best. This existential situation is unbearable to the ego, so it does what addicts do. It reaches for its drug of choice, and for the ego, that drug is thought. Compulsive, obsessive, continuous thought, because thinking creates the illusion of control. If I think about it enough, if I plan thoroughly enough, if I analyze deeply enough, if I worry intensely enough, maybe, just maybe, I can make the uncertain certain. Maybe I can make myself safe in an unsafe world, but you cannot. And every moment you spend lost in thought is a moment you are not actually living, not actually present for the life that is happening now. The philosopher Alan Watts once said, "Man suffers only because he takes seriously what the gods made for fun." But we could also say, man suffers because he takes control seriously in a universe that offers only participation. You cannot control whether you will get sick, whether people will love you, whether your plans will succeed, whether the world will unfold according to your preferences. The only thing you can do is show up fully for whatever arises, respond with clarity and compassion, and accept that the outcome is not ultimately in your hands. But acceptance feels like death to the ego. Surrender feels like annihilation. So the ego keeps thinking, keeps worrying, keeps planning, keeps analyzing, anything but face the raw truth of existence, that you are not in control, that you never were, and that the peace you are seeking lies in accepting this rather than fighting it. Now let us trace this addiction through the developmental arc of a human life, because understanding where it begins helps us understand why it persists. You were not born addicted to thinking. If you watch an infant, you will notice something extraordinary. They are present, fully, completely, unself-consciously present. They do not worry about the past or future. They do not judge their experience or compare it to how things should be. They simply are, experiencing each moment as it arises, responding directly and spontaneously. But then, something happens. Around age 2 or 3, self-awareness emerges. The child learns to say I and me. They begin to distinguish themselves from the environment. The ego is born, and with it, the need for control. Watch a toddler, and you will see the first attempts at control. No becomes their favorite word. They are discovering their separateness and testing their power to affect reality. This is healthy. This is necessary. The ego is not a mistake. It is a developmental achievement. But somewhere along the way, something goes wrong. The ego, which was meant to be a tool for navigating reality, becomes the master. The sense of being a separate self, which was meant to be one mode of consciousness among many, becomes the only mode we know. And the thinking that was meant to serve us becomes our master. This happens gradually, through socialization. Parents, teachers, and society teach you that you are your thoughts, your achievements, your image. You are rewarded for certain kinds of thinking and punished for others. You learn to monitor yourself constantly, to judge your experience, to compare yourself to others. The natural spontaneity of childhood gives way to the self-consciousness of adolescence, and then to the chronic anxiety of adulthood. By the time you are 20, 30, 40 years old, you have spent so many years identified with your thoughts that you cannot imagine any other way to be. The prison has become so familiar that it feels like home. The addiction has progressed so far that you no longer recognize it as an addiction, but it is. By every definition, compulsive thinking is an addiction. You cannot stop, even when you want to. You experience withdrawal, anxiety, discomfort when you try to be still. You develop tolerance, needing more and more mental activity to achieve the same sense of control. Your life becomes increasingly constrained by the addiction, and most tellingly, you continue the behavior despite clear evidence that it is causing you suffering. This is not a metaphor. The neuroscience supports it. Studies using fMRI scans have shown that compulsive worrying activates the same brain regions, particularly the orbitofrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens, that are activated in substance addiction. The brain, in its attempt to reduce uncertainty and anxiety through thought, creates a feedback loop that reinforces the very behavior that generates the anxiety in the first place. You think to reduce anxiety, but the thinking creates more anxiety, which creates more thinking, which creates more anxiety. An endless spiral that psychologists call rumination. And rumination, research has proven, is one of the strongest predictors of depression and anxiety disorders. The mind has become its own abuser. Carl Jung understood this deeply. He wrote about the inflation of consciousness, the ego's tendency to over-identify with the thinking mind and lose contact with the deeper, unconscious aspects of the psyche. He warned that modern civilization was creating a one-sided development of consciousness, producing people who were brilliant at abstract thought, but cut off from instinct, intuition, and direct experience. Jung called for individuation, a process of integrating the conscious and unconscious, the ego and the shadow, the thinking mind and the deeper self. But individuation requires letting go of the ego's demand for total control. It requires descending into uncertainty, facing the unknown aspects of yourself, surrendering to a wisdom larger than the thinking mind. Most people never take this journey. They remain trapped in what Jung called the sleep of the mind, a state of unconscious identification with thoughts and beliefs, where the ego controls consciousness and genuine self-awareness is absent. They live their entire lives without ever waking up to the fact that they are not their thoughts, that there is a vast dimension of being beyond the chattering mind. And this brings us to the most unsettling realization of all. Most human suffering is not caused by external circumstances, but by the mind's response to those circumstances. It is not life that torments you. It is your thinking about life. It is not the present moment that causes you anxiety. It is your thoughts about past and future. It is not reality itself that you cannot accept. It is the story your mind tells about reality. The Buddha discovered this 2,500 years ago and called it dukkha, usually translated as suffering, but more accurately meaning dissatisfaction, unease, the inherent stress of existence when you resist what is. And he traced this suffering to its root, tanha, craving, specifically the craving for permanence in an impermanent world, for control in an uncontrollable reality, for certainty in an uncertain existence. The solution he proposed was not more thinking, but less, not more control, but acceptance, not strengthening the ego, but seeing through it. He taught meditation not as a relaxation technique, but as a tool for deconstructing the illusion of self, for experiencing consciousness without the constant filter of thought, for breaking the addiction to mental control. But the ego resists this fiercely, because from the ego's perspective, stopping thought is death, losing control is annihilation, accepting uncertainty is surrender to chaos, so the addiction continues, and the prison holds. Unless you understand, with absolute clarity, what the thinking mind actually is, not what it pretends to be, but what it really is. And to understand that, we must go even deeper. We must look at the darkest truth that the ego hides from itself. The philosopher Blaise Pascal once wrote, "All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone." That sentence contains an entire psychology. Why can't you sit quietly alone? Because in the silence, with no distractions, you must face yourself. And what you will find there, what the ego works so desperately to avoid, is emptiness. Not emptiness in the nihilistic sense, emptiness in the sense that the self you take to be solid, permanent, and real is actually a construction, a process, a flow of mental activity with no fixed essence. The ego is like a tornado. It appears solid from a distance, but up close it is just wind spinning around nothing. This is the truth that compulsive thinking is designed to hide. There is no fixed self at the center of your experience. There is only experience, arising and passing, and the illusion of a separate you experiencing it. The thinker is not separate from the thoughts. The controller is not separate from what is being controlled. Subject and object, self and world, are dualistic concepts imposed on a reality that is actually non-dual, seamless, whole. But if there is no fixed self, then who is thinking? Who is trying to control? This question, if pursued deeply enough, dissolves the entire structure of the ego's false certainty. The ego cannot allow this question to be fully asked, so it keeps you busy. It keeps you identified with thoughts, beliefs, stories, identities. It keeps you distracted with problems to solve, goals to achieve, threats to avoid. Anything but face the possibility that the one who is seeking control does not actually exist as the separate, autonomous entity it takes itself to be. This is why spiritual awakening is often described as a death. Not the death of the body, but the death of the illusion of separation. And the ego will fight this death with every weapon in its arsenal, and its primary weapon is thought. Compulsive thinking is the ego's last line of defense against the truth of no self. But here is the paradox that we must carry with us into the next part of this journey. The ego is not your enemy. It is not evil. It is not even wrong. It is simply a survival mechanism that has outlived its original purpose and become overactive, like an immune system that attacks healthy tissue. The solution is not to destroy the ego. That is impossible. The ego is a natural function of consciousness. The solution is to see through it, to recognize it for what it is, to no longer be hypnotized by its stories and demands, and that seeing through, that awakening from the sleep of the mind, that is where we go next. The darkness of false control. Now we descend, not into theory, but into lived experience, into the actual texture of the prison you inhabit, into the specific ways that the addiction to thinking manifests in your daily life, in your relationships, in your quiet moments alone, into the psychological warfare between the need for control and the reality of uncontrollability, into the suffering that results when the irresistible force of the ego's demand meets the immovable object of reality's indifference. This is where the journey gets difficult, because I am going to ask you to look at mechanisms you have spent your whole life avoiding. I'm going to ask you to see the ways you use thinking to escape the present moment. I'm going to ask you to recognize the control strategies you employ, many of them so subtle and automatic you have never noticed them before. And most challenging of all, I'm going to ask you to see how much of what you call yourself is nothing more than a collection of these control strategies, recycled thoughts, and defensive mechanisms. Are you ready? Let us start with the morning. You open your eyes, and within seconds, sometimes before you are even fully awake, the thoughts begin. What day is it? What do I have to do today? What problems am I dealing with? What did I forget yesterday? The mental checklist starts compiling itself. The narrator switches on. The internal commentary begins. But notice, those first few thoughts are not responding to the present moment. They are pulling you out of the present moment into the realm of time, past and future. And in doing so, they are creating the sense of a separate self who must navigate through time, managing problems, achieving goals, avoiding threats. This is not an accident. This is the ego establishing itself. It needs time to exist. It needs problems to solve and goals to achieve. Because without those things, what is there? Just this. Just the simple, immediate experience of being alive, which requires no thinking at all. But the ego cannot tolerate just this. Just this is not enough. Just this needs to be analyzed, judged, compared, improved. So the thinking begins, and it does not stop until you lose consciousness again at night, and even then it continues in the form of dreams. Now let us look at what happens when you are with another person. You are having a conversation, but are you really present? Or is part of your mind, perhaps most of your mind, engaged in parallel processing? You are listening, but you are also preparing your response. You are evaluating what they are saying. You are monitoring how you are being perceived. You are managing your image. You are controlling the interaction. And what is lost in this? The actual connection. The raw, unmediated meeting of two consciousnesses. Because real connection requires presence, and presence requires the temporary suspension of the controlling mind. This is why relationships are often unfulfilling. Not because you chose the wrong person, but because you are never fully there. You are always half absent, lost in thoughts about the relationship rather than being present within it. You are managing rather than connecting. You are controlling rather than surrendering to the vulnerability of genuine encounter. The addiction to control makes intimacy impossible, because intimacy means into me see, allowing yourself to be seen without the protective armor of the ego's strategies. And that is precisely what the controlling mind cannot allow. Now let us go deeper into the specific manifestations of this addiction, because it does not present itself honestly. It disguises itself. It justifies itself. It pretends to be helping you when it is actually imprisoning you. The first mask the addiction wears is worry. Worry presents itself as preparation, as responsibility, as caring. I'm worrying about my children because I love them. I'm worrying about my presentation because I care about doing well. I'm worrying about my health because I want to take care of myself. But look closer. What is worry actually doing? It is replaying possible negative futures in your mind over and over with no plan for addressing them. It is not problem solving. Problem solving leads to action. Worry is mental simulation without action, creating suffering in the present about events that have not happened and probably never will. Research from Dr. Robert Leahy at the American Institute for Cognitive Therapy found that 85% of what people worry about never happens, and of the 15% that does happen, 79% of people reported they handled it better than they expected. This means that 97% of worry is creating suffering about nothing. But the addiction does not care about statistics. It cares about control, and worry gives the illusion of control. If I worry about it enough, I'll be prepared. I'll see it coming. I'll be able to prevent it. But you cannot prevent the future through worry. You can only torment the present. The second mask is planning. Planning is necessary. Intelligent planning is essential for achieving goals, but the addiction to thinking turns planning into endless mental simulation. You do not plan once and then act. You plan repeatedly, obsessively, compulsively. You run through the same scenarios again and again, refining details that do not need refining, preparing for contingencies that are vanishingly unlikely. Why? Because as long as you are planning, you feel in control. As long as you are thinking about the future, you are not confronting the uncertainty of the present. As long as you can maintain the fantasy that sufficient planning will make outcomes certain, you can avoid the terrifying truth. No amount of planning can make life predictable. The third mask is analysis. You analyze your relationships, your feelings, your past decisions, other people's motives. You dissect conversations, search for hidden meanings, construct elaborate theories about why things happened the way they did. You think that understanding equals control, that if you can just figure out the pattern, you can predict and manipulate future outcomes. But analysis is often just a sophisticated form of rumination. It is the mind churning over the same material, looking for answers to questions that have no answers, trying to extract certainty from experiences that were inherently ambiguous. And here is the trap. Analysis can be genuinely useful. Reflection can lead to insight. But the addiction to thinking hijacks these tools and turns them into weapons against presence. You cannot tell the difference between useful reflection and compulsive rumination because they feel the same from the inside. Both give the mind something to do. Both create the illusion of control. Both distract you from the rawness of direct experience. The fourth mask is memory. You replay conversations, rehash old arguments, revisit past mistakes. Sometimes this is dressed up as learning from experience. But look honestly. How much of your remembering is actually useful learning, and how much is just compulsive replaying? The addiction to thinking uses memory to reinforce the ego's narrative about itself. You replay the times you were hurt to justify your defenses. You replay your successes to bolster your self-image. You replay your failures to punish yourself. None of this is happening now. All of it is a prison of thought. And the cruelest aspect, every time you replay a painful memory, you are re-experiencing the trauma. The body cannot tell the difference between a real threat and a vividly imagined one. So each replay triggers the stress response, floods your system with cortisol, reinforces the neural pathways of suffering. You are literally torturing yourself with your own thoughts and calling it processing or understanding. The fifth mask is identity maintenance. Who are you? The answer to that question is a story, constantly being told and retold by the thinking mind. I am a good person. I am successful. I am a victim. I am struggling. I am evolving. I am whatever narrative the ego has constructed. But identity is not a thing. It is a process of continuous mental activity. Every time you think about yourself, you are reinforcing this identity. Every time you tell your story, you are strengthening its hold over you. Every time you defend your self-image, you are building thicker prison walls. And here is what the ego will never admit. Maintaining this false identity requires enormous energy. You are constantly monitoring yourself, editing your behavior, managing how others see you, defending against threats to your self-image. This is exhausting, and it prevents you from ever being authentically yourself, because yourself has become a performance, a construction, a mask you wear even when you are alone. Now let us look at what happens when reality refuses to cooperate with the ego's demand for control, because reality always, eventually, refuses. Life is fundamentally uncontrollable. People die, relationships end, bodies age, plans fail. The future remains uncertain no matter how much you think about it. When this uncontrollability becomes undeniable, the ego has several defense mechanisms it deploys. First, it intensifies the thinking. If planning did not work, plan more. If worrying did not prevent the bad outcome, worry harder next time. If analysis did not provide certainty, analyze deeper. The addiction doubles down, like a gambler who keeps betting more to try to recover his losses. Second, it blames yourself or others, but someone must be at fault. Because if someone is to blame, that means the situation was actually controllable. It was just controlled badly. This preserves the fundamental illusion that control is possible, just misapplied. Third, it numbs. When thinking becomes too painful, the ego seeks escape through substances, through distraction, through compulsive behaviors. But even these escapes are attempts at control. You cannot control external reality, so you try to control your internal state. You cannot make life certain, so you try to make your consciousness predictable through substances or behaviors that reliably produce specific mental states. Fourth, it creates meaning. The ego constructs elaborate explanations for why things happened. Karma, fate, God's plan, lessons to learn, challenges for growth. These narratives serve a psychological purpose. They make the chaos feel ordered, they make suffering feel meaningful, they make the uncontrollable feel like part of a larger pattern that could theoretically be understood and predicted. I am not saying that life has no meaning. I am saying that the compulsive creation of meaning narratives is often just another control strategy, another way to avoid confronting the raw uncertainty and occasional arbitrary cruelty of existence. All of these defense mechanisms share one feature. They require more thinking. They strengthen the addiction. They reinforce the prison. Let me take you into a specific example, one that millions of people are experiencing right now. It is 2 a.m. You cannot sleep. Your mind is racing. Perhaps it is a work problem, a relationship issue, a health concern, a financial worry. The content does not matter. The structure is always the same. The thoughts circle and spiral. You examine the problem from every angle. You imagine worst-case scenarios. You plan responses. You replay past conversations. You rehearse future ones. You analyze motives, yours and others. You try to figure out what you should have done, what you should do, what you will do. And underneath all this mental activity is a feeling, anxiety, a tight knot in your chest or stomach, a sense of being trapped, a feeling of urgency and helplessness combined. Now let me ask you something crucial. Is the anxiety causing the thoughts, or are the thoughts causing the anxiety? The ego would have you believe that the anxiety is caused by the problem itself, the external situation that you are thinking about. But this is not true. The external situation is not present. You are lying in bed. There is no actual threat in the room. The only thing present is thought. And it is the thoughts about the situation, the mental simulation of possible futures, the replay of past events, the analysis of what it all means, that is creating the physiological anxiety response. You are torturing yourself with imagination. And the thinking continues because the ego believes, genuinely believes, that if it just thinks hard enough, it will find a solution that will make the anxiety go away. But it never does. Because the thinking is the anxiety. They are not separate phenomena. They are two aspects of the same process. The ego trying desperately to control an uncontrollable situation. And here is the tragic irony. The actual problem you are thinking about probably has a solution, or at least a next step. But you cannot see it clearly because your mind is too clouded with anxious thought. The thinking that promises to solve the problem is the very thing preventing you from seeing the solution. Wisdom does not come from more thinking. It comes from quiet clarity, from a mind that is still enough to perceive reality as it actually is rather than through the distorting lens of fear and desire. Now we must address the most painful aspect of this descent, the realization that you are doing this to yourself, not because you are weak or foolish, not because you are failing at life, but because you were never taught any other way. You were trained, from childhood, to believe that you are your thoughts. You were taught that thinking is how you solve problems, that constant mental activity is a sign of intelligence and responsibility, that worry means you care, that planning means you are prudent, that analysis means you are wise. All of these are lies, or rather partial truths, that have been distorted into prisons. The devastating realization, and this is where many people resist most fiercely, is that most of your suffering is optional. Not all of it. Pain is inevitable, loss is real, the body ages, death comes. These are the unavoidable sufferings of existence. But the suffering created by compulsive thinking, the anxiety, the depression, the exhaustion, the sense of being constantly overwhelmed, this suffering is not inevitable. It is not being done to you by life. It is being done by you to you, through unconscious identification with the thinking mind. And the moment you see this clearly, not intellectually but experientially, something shifts. Because if you are creating the suffering, then you also have the power to stop creating it. Not through force, not through more thinking, but through a fundamental shift in your relationship with thought itself. But before we can reach that shift, we must go even deeper into the darkness. Because there is one more layer to this prison, one more aspect of the addiction to control that must be exposed before it can be released. The ultimate form of control that the ego seeks is control over death. You know you will die. Unlike any other animal, you are cursed and blessed with this knowledge, and the ego cannot accept it. It cannot accept that the self it has spent so much energy constructing will one day cease to exist. So it creates buffers, it builds monuments, it makes plans for a future it will not inhabit, it accumulates things, it seeks to be remembered. It searches for belief systems that promise continuity, reincarnation, heaven, legacy, immortality through offspring or achievements, and in the present moment it tries to avoid any experience that reminds it of mortality. It stays busy, it keeps thinking, because stillness feels too much like death, silence feels too much like non-existence. Presence without the constant commentary of the ego feels too much like the dissolution that waits at the end. The psychologist Ernest Becker wrote an entire book on this, The Denial of Death, arguing that most human behavior can be understood as elaborate defenses against the terror of mortality. Culture itself is a collective project to deny death, to create symbolic immortality, to pretend that the self is more permanent than it actually is, and compulsive thinking is the ego's daily ritual of death denial. Every thought reinforces the illusion of continuity. Every plan projects into a future where you still exist. Every memory confirms that you have existed across time. The stream of consciousness creates the impression of a continuous self, when in reality, the self is reconstructed from moment to moment, a temporary pattern that will eventually dissolve. This is the deepest truth that the addiction to control is designed to hide. You are already dying, moment by moment, and the self you are trying so desperately to preserve is already gone. The you of 10 years ago no longer exists. The you of yesterday is gone. The you that was reading the beginning of this script has already been replaced by a slightly different you reading these words now. Continuity is an illusion created by memory and thought, and the ego clings to this illusion with such desperation because letting go of it feels like death. But what if death, not physical death, but ego death, the death of the false self, is not the end but the beginning? What if the space on the other side of compulsive thinking is not emptiness, but fullness? What if presence, the eternal now beyond time, is more real than the phantom self constructed by thought? These questions lead us out of the descent and into the ascent, out of the darkness and toward the light, out of the prison and into freedom. But first, one final confrontation with the warden. The voice of the ego, when you begin to question it, becomes defensive. It uses your own thoughts against you. If you stop thinking, you will become passive, irresponsible, unsuccessful. If you stop worrying, you will fail to prepare for real dangers. If you stop analyzing, you will miss important information. If you stop maintaining your identity, you will lose yourself. If you stop trying to control your life, everything will fall apart. These thoughts feel true. They feel urgent. They feel like the voice of wisdom and reason. But they are not. They are the voice of the addiction defending itself. They are the prison guard, telling you that you need to stay locked up for your own protection. And here is how you know they are lies. People who have broken this addiction, through meditation, through therapy, through psychedelic experiences, through spiritual practice, through simple, exhausted surrender, do not become passive or irresponsible. They become more effective, more present, more capable of responding wisely to life rather than reacting compulsively. Because when the mind is quiet, clarity arises. When thinking stops being compulsive, intelligence can function. When the ego loosens its grip, something deeper, call it presence, consciousness, being, the self with a capital S, can guide your actions. You do not need to think constantly to live well. You need to think clearly when thinking is called for, and then return to presence when thinking is not needed. You need to use the mind as a tool rather than being used by it. But the ego cannot conceive of this possibility. From its perspective, the end of compulsive thinking is the end of everything. So it fights, it resists, it creates fear and urgency and convincing arguments for why you must keep thinking, must maintain control, must never stop. And this brings us to the threshold, to the moment of choice that everyone must eventually face. Do you continue to believe the ego's promises of safety through control? Or do you take the terrifying step into the unknown, into presence, into the direct experience of life without the constant filter of thought? This choice cannot be made through thinking. It can only be made through action, through practice, through the willingness to experiment with a different way of being. And that experiment, that journey from compulsive thinking to conscious presence, is where we go next. Breaking free from the mind's prison. There is a moment that comes to every prisoner, a moment when they realize that the cell door has been unlocked all along, that they have been free to leave at any time, but they did not know, and so they stayed. This moment is not transcendent or mystical, though it can feel that way. It is simple, ordinary, obvious once you see it, like suddenly noticing your breathing. You were doing it all along, but you were not aware of it until attention turned toward it. This is the nature of awakening from the addiction to thinking. You discover that you are not your thoughts. You have always been the awareness that observes thoughts, But you mistook yourself for the contents of awareness. It is a profound shift, and yet nothing changes. The world remains as it was. Thoughts continue to arise, but your relationship to them transforms. You are no longer identified with the thinking mind. You are no longer trapped in the prison of compulsive control. You are free, and you always were. Let us explore how this freedom is discovered. The first crack in the prison wall comes through witnessing, not trying to stop your thoughts, not judging them, not engaging with them, but simply watching them as they arise and pass. Try it now. For just 30 seconds, step back from your thoughts and watch them like you would watch clouds passing across the sky. Do not think about them. Do not push them away. Just notice. A thought arises, exists for a moment, and dissolves. Then another thought arises. Who is watching? Not the thoughts themselves. Thoughts cannot watch other thoughts. There must be something prior to thought, something that exists whether thoughts are present or absent, something that remains constant while the contents of consciousness change. The mystics call this witness consciousness or pure awareness. The scientist might call it metacognition or self-reflective awareness. The language does not matter. What matters is the direct experience. You are not the thinker. You are the awareness in which thinking occurs. This is not a philosophical position. This is reportable, first-person experience. And once you have it, even briefly, the addiction begins to lose its power. Because you have experienced yourself as separate from the thoughts, which means you are no longer controlled by them. The thoughts continue. They must. This is how the brain works. But they become optional, background noise rather than the entirety of your experience. You can engage with them when they are useful and let them pass when they are not. This is the first step toward freedom, disidentification. Recognizing that thoughts are objects arising in your awareness, not the subject of experience. They are something you experience, not what you are. But the ego fights this recognition, because if you are not your thoughts, then what are you? And if the thinker is just another thought, then who is in control? These questions are threatening to the ego precisely because they undermine its existence. The ego is nothing more than the continuous process of self-referential thinking. Stop identifying with thoughts, and the ego begins to fade, like a flashlight beam that appears solid until you realize it is only illuminating darkness. The second crack appears through presence. This is the ability to be fully here, now, in this moment, without the mind's commentary or judgment. Presence is not a state you achieve. It is what remains when thinking stops dominating your attention. It is your natural condition, covered over by layers of mental noise. You have experienced presence before, probably many times, though you may not have recognized it. Those moments when you were so absorbed in an activity, playing music, creating art, being in nature, making love, playing sports, that self-consciousness disappeared. When there was no sense of time passing, no internal dialogue, no separation between observer and observed. Athletes call it the zone. Psychologists call it flow state. Mystics call it samadhi or unity consciousness. What they all describe is the same phenomenon, consciousness without the filter of compulsive thinking, direct experience without the ego's mediation. And here is the discovery that changes everything. Presence is not rare or difficult. It is always available. It is simply obscured by the addiction to thinking. Every moment is an opportunity for presence, not just special moments, not just peak experiences, but ordinary moments. Drinking tea, walking, listening, breathing. The raw sensory immediacy of being alive prior to the mind's interpretation and commentary. But the ego resists presence. Why? Because in presence the ego diminishes. The sense of being a separate self, trying to control life, drops away. There is just life, happening. No one doing it. No distance between subject and object. Just the seamless flow of experience. This is terrifying to the ego and liberating to consciousness. The third crack comes through acceptance, not passive resignation, but active embrace of reality as it is, rather than as you think it should be. The ego's primary activity is resistance, resistance to what is happening, to what has happened, to what might happen. This resistance manifests as thinking, worry, regret, planning, analyzing, judging. All forms of the mind trying to be somewhere other than here, somewhere other than now. But reality does not care about your preferences. It unfolds according to its own logic, its own patterns. And every moment you spend resisting reality is a moment you spend suffering. Acceptance does not mean liking what is happening. It does not mean giving up on changing things. It means acknowledging what is true right now, without the overlay of judgment and complaint. It means responding to reality rather than fighting with it in your mind. The Buddhist teacher Season1 has a formula: suffering, chaks, pain, x resistance. Pain is inevitable. It is part of being alive in a body, in a world where things change and die. But suffering is optional. It is the mental layer we add through resistance, through our refusal to accept what is. When resistance drops, something extraordinary happens. Even painful experiences become bearable, sometimes even peaceful. Not because the pain disappears, but because the suffering, the mental anguish, the why me, the this shouldn't be happening, dissolves. You are left with just the raw experience, arising and passing, like everything else. And in that acceptance there is a strange freedom. Not freedom from pain, but freedom within pain. Not escape from reality, but full participation in it. The fourth crack appears through surrender. This is the most misunderstood concept, so listen carefully. Surrender does not mean giving up. It means giving up the illusion that you are ever in control. You cannot control most of what happens in your life. You cannot control other people's thoughts, feelings, or actions. You cannot control the economy, the weather, or world events. You cannot control your body's ultimate trajectory toward decline and death. You cannot control the arising of thoughts and emotions in your own consciousness. What you can control is limited. Your actions in this moment, your attention, your response to circumstances, and even these are only partially under your control, influenced by genetics, conditioning, neurobiology, and factors you are not conscious of. The addiction to thinking is based on the fantasy of total control, and every moment spent trying to achieve this fantasy is a moment spent in frustration and exhaustion. Surrender is the recognition that you are not the author of your life, but a participant in it. You are not the controller, but the responder. And in that recognition, a tremendous burden lifts. You no longer have to maintain the exhausting pretense that you can make life conform to your will. You can simply show up, respond wisely to what arises, and let go of the rest. This does not make you passive. It makes you effective. Because when you are not wasting energy trying to control the uncontrollable, you have more energy available for the things you can actually influence. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught this 2,000 years ago. Make the best use of what is in your power, and take the rest as it happens. But we have forgotten this wisdom, and we suffer for it. Surrender is not weakness. It is recognition of reality. And paradoxically, it is only through surrender that real power becomes available. Not the power to control outcomes, but the power to remain centered, clear, and responsive regardless of circumstances. Now we come to the practices, not theories, but actual methods for breaking the addiction to thinking and cultivating presence. The first practice is meditation, not meditation as relaxation or stress reduction, though those are side effects. Meditation as training in awareness, in learning to observe thoughts without identifying with them. Sit quietly, watch your breath. When thoughts arise, and they will, thousands of them, simply notice them and return attention to the breath. You are not trying to empty your mind. You are training yourself to see thoughts as objects rather than being merged with them. Over time, this practice rewires the brain. Studies using fMRI have shown that long-term meditators have decreased activity in the default mode network, that network we discussed earlier that generates compulsive self-referential thinking. The addiction to thinking literally weakens with practice, but do not meditate with the goal of achieving anything. That is just the ego trying to control the uncontrollable. Meditate to become familiar with your own consciousness, to learn what you actually are beneath the thinking mind. The second practice is mindful inquiry. Throughout your day, ask yourself, what am I thinking right now? Is this thought useful? Is it true? Am I solving a problem or just creating suffering? Most thoughts, when examined, cannot survive the light of awareness. They reveal themselves as repetitive, useless, or based on false assumptions, and simply seeing this clearly is often enough to dissolve them. The third practice is present moment awareness. Multiple times each day, stop and fully inhabit your senses. What do you actually see, hear, feel, smell, taste right now? Not your thoughts about these things, but the raw sensory experience. This practice pulls you out of the time-based realm of thinking and into the timeless now. It interrupts the addiction by replacing mental content with direct perception. The fourth practice is conscious breathing, not as a relaxation technique, but as an anchor to the present moment. Your breath is always here, always now. When you notice you are lost in thought, simply return attention to breathing, not controlling it, just observing it. This simple practice can break the spell of compulsive thinking in seconds, because you cannot breathe in the past or future. You can only breathe now. The fifth practice is doing one thing at a time. In a culture that glorifies multitasking and constant mental activity, this is radical. Give your full attention to whatever you are doing, no matter how mundane. Washing dishes, wash dishes, walking, walk, listening, listen. Stop trying to be mentally somewhere else, planning the next thing, reviewing the last thing. Be here, fully, in this activity. This is not about productivity. This is about liberation from the tyranny of the divided mind. But practices alone are not enough. You must also understand the why, the deeper motivation that sustains the practices when the ego resists. Why break free from compulsive thinking? Not just to feel calmer or happier, though those are benefits, but because your life is happening now and you are missing it. While you are lost in thoughts about past and future, the miracle of existence is occurring around you and within you. Your heart is beating, your lungs are breathing, light is entering your eyes, sounds are vibrating your eardrums. The entire universe is expressing itself as this moment, this one, irreplaceable, never to return moment, and you are elsewhere, in the phantom realm of thought. This is not a metaphor. You are literally missing your life, the only life you have, the only moment you can ever experience, right now. And you are trading it for the mental simulation of life, the second-hand experience of existence filtered through the ego's commentary. When you see this clearly, not just understand it intellectually but feel it viscerally, a natural urgency arises, not the frantic urgency of the ego, but a different quality, a recognition that there is no time to waste on unconscious identification with thinking, that life is too short, too precious, too fleeting to spend lost in mental noise. This recognition is not morbid, it is life-affirming. It is what the existentialists called authentic being, living in full awareness of your mortality, which makes every moment vibrant with significance. Now we must address the fear that arises when you begin to break free from the addiction to thinking. Who will you be without the constant mental activity? The ego interprets the end of compulsive thinking as the end of self, and in a sense it is right. The false self, the constructed identity maintained by thought, does dissolve when thinking becomes non-compulsive. But what emerges is not nothing. What emerges is your true nature, which was always there, hidden beneath the noise. Different traditions describe this true nature in different terms. The Buddhists call it Buddha nature, or no self. The Hindus call it Atman, or Brahman. Carl Jung called it the self with a capital S. The Christian mystics called it the soul or the divine within. Neuroscientists might simply call it consciousness or awareness. Again, the language does not matter. What matters is the direct experience. When compulsive thinking subsides, what remains is not emptiness but fullness, not absence but presence, not death but life, vivid, immediate, undeniable life prior to interpretation. You discover that you are not the narrow, anxious, controlling ego you took yourself to be. You are the vast awareness in which all experience arises, thoughts, emotions, sensations, perceptions. And this awareness is not troubled by the contents of experience. It is like the sky that remains unchanged whether clouds pass through or not. This is not a belief system. This is direct observation. And it is available to you right now. Stop reading for a moment. Put attention on the awareness that is reading, not the thoughts about what you are reading, but the consciousness itself, that which is aware, that which exists prior to and independent of any content of mind. That is what you are. Not just that, you are also a person, a body, a particular expression of consciousness with a unique history and characteristics. Both are true. You are the wave and the ocean, the form and the formless, the individual and the universal. But you have been identified only with the wave, with the form, with the individual. And this partial identification is the source of all existential anxiety, because the wave knows it will dissolve back into the ocean, the form knows it will return to formlessness, the individual knows it will die. But when you recognize yourself as the ocean, as the formless, as the universal consciousness temporarily expressing as an individual, then death loses its terror. Not because you believe in an afterlife, but because you have experienced directly that what you truly are was never born and can never die. It is the eternal now, the timeless presence, the awareness that witnesses the coming and going of all phenomena, including the body and mind you call yourself. This realization, when it comes, and it comes not through thinking but through practice and grace, changes everything and nothing. The world remains the same. You still have to do dishes, pay bills, navigate relationships, but you do these things from a different place, with a different quality of being. You are no longer imprisoned in your thoughts. You are free to think when thinking is useful and be present when it is not. You are no longer addicted to the illusion of control. You are surrendered to the mystery of existence, participating fully in life without the exhausting pretense that you can determine all outcomes. And perhaps most importantly, you are no longer seeking. The compulsive thinking was always a form of seeking security, seeking certainty, seeking control. But when you discover what you truly are, seeking stops. Not because you have found what you were looking for in the world, but because you have discovered that what you were seeking was never outside yourself. You were seeking the peace of your own true nature, which was always here, just obscured by the noise of the thinking mind. Let me tell you about the moment when this realization broke through for me, not perfectly, not permanently, but enough to change the trajectory of my life. I was sitting in meditation as I had done thousands of times before. My mind was its usual chaos, planning, worrying, analyzing. I was judging myself for being a bad meditator, which was just more thinking. And then, in the midst of this noise, a question arose with unusual clarity. Who is noticing that I am thinking? It was not a complicated question. It was simple, almost childish. But it pierced through something. Because I realized that in order to know I was thinking, something had to be observing the thinking, and whatever that something was, it could not itself be a thought. In that moment, there was a slight shift, like a camera pulling back. I was no longer merged with my thoughts. I was watching them from a slight distance. The thinking continued, but I was no longer in it. I was prior to it, outside it, containing it. It lasted maybe 10 seconds before I got excited about the experience and thought about it, which collapsed the space. But those 10 seconds showed me something irrevocable. I am not my thoughts. I am what notices thoughts. And this noticing, this awareness, is always here, always available, always free. From that moment, the addiction began to lose its grip. Not instantly, not completely. I still get caught in compulsive thinking many times a day, but now there is a reference point, a possibility that did not exist before. I know that freedom is real because I have tasted it, and once you have tasted it, you cannot pretend the prison is inevitable. This is what awaits you on the other side of the addiction to thinking, not the end of thought, but freedom from the tyranny of compulsive thought. Not the destruction of the ego, but the recognition that the ego is a tool, not your identity. Not escape from life, but full participation in life, undistracted by the mind's endless commentary. But I must be honest with you, this is not a one-time realization that permanently solves everything. It is a practice, a way of being that must be renewed again and again. The addiction to thinking is deeply grooved into your nervous system. The patterns of the ego have been reinforced for decades. They do not disappear just because you see through them intellectually. What happens is this: you have moments of presence, moments of freedom, and then you get pulled back into identification with thinking. You wake up, and then you fall back asleep. You remember, and then you forget, over and over. And this is normal. This is the process. But each time you wake up, each time you remember that you are not your thoughts, the pattern weakens slightly. The neural pathways of compulsive thinking become less automatic. The space of awareness becomes more familiar. And gradually, over time, presence becomes more frequent, longer lasting, more stable. You do not arrive at a destination. You do not reach a state of permanent enlightenment where thinking never arises or the ego completely disappears. That is a fantasy. What happens is more subtle and more real. You establish a new baseline, a new center of gravity. And from that center, you can think when thinking is useful, feel when feeling arises, act when action is called for, and return to presence when nothing needs to be done. This is maturity. This is wisdom. This is freedom. The mind unchained. So we have traveled far, you and I, from the prison of compulsive thinking, through the darkness of false control into the light of conscious awareness. We have seen the architecture of the addiction, understood its mechanisms, and glimpsed the possibility of freedom. But this has all been words, concepts, ideas, more content for the thinking mind. And the final paradox is this: you cannot think your way out of the addiction to thinking. You can understand it. You can see it clearly. But seeing is not enough. You must practice. You must experiment. You must be willing to sit with the discomfort that arises when the constant mental activity begins to quiet. You must be willing to face the emptiness that the ego has spent your whole life avoiding. This is not easy. If it were easy, everyone would be awake. Everyone would be free. But most people will finish reading this, nod in recognition, perhaps feel momentarily inspired, and then return to their normal patterns. The addiction will reassert itself. The prison will feel comfortable again. The illusion of control will be too attractive to surrender. Do not be most people. You have been given a tremendous gift, the awareness that you are imprisoned. Many people live their entire lives without recognizing the cage. They suffer unconsciously, automatically, believing that this is simply what life is. But you know better now. You have seen the bars. You understand the mechanism. You cannot unknow this. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you use it to think more about thinking, creating new mental patterns while claiming to be free of them? Or will you actually practice? Will you actually return to presence again and again, building new neural pathways, weakening the addiction, discovering directly what you truly are. This is not a rhetorical question. This is the question that will define the quality of your remaining days on this earth. Let me leave you with a vision. Imagine a version of yourself, perhaps 1 year from now, perhaps 10, who has broken free from the addiction to thinking. Not perfectly, but significantly. What is that person's life like? They wake in the morning, and before the thoughts rush in, they notice the simple fact of consciousness. They are here, alive, aware. They spend a few moments in this awareness before engaging with the day's activities. They go through their day, meeting each moment freshly, responding to what is actually happening, rather than being lost in thoughts about what happened or might happen. When thinking is needed, they think clearly and effectively. When it is not needed, they return to presence, to the raw sensory experience of being alive. They still have challenges, still face difficulties, but they do not add unnecessary suffering through resistance and compulsive thinking. They respond to problems with clarity and action, rather than reacting with anxious rumination. They are present with other people in a way that creates genuine connection. People feel met by them, heard by them, because they are actually there, not lost in self-referential thought while pretending to listen. They experience moments of profound peace, not because their life is perfect, but because they have learned to be still. They have discovered that beneath the noise of thinking, there is a silence that is not empty but full of awareness, full of life, full of something that can only be called grace. They still plan and remember and analyze when appropriate. But these are tools they use consciously, not addictions that use them. They are no longer imprisoned in the mind. They are free to inhabit the mind when it serves them, and to rest in presence when it does not. Is this possible for you? Yes. Absolutely. Unquestionably yes. Because this person I am describing is not special. They are not enlightened in some supernatural sense. They have simply learned to see through the illusion of the separate self maintained by compulsive thinking. And what they have learned, you can learn. What they have practiced, you can practice. The only question is, will you? There is a Zen saying, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The activities of life do not change. What changes is the quality of presence you bring to them, the freedom you experience within them. This is the promise and the reality of breaking free from the addiction to thinking, not escape from ordinary life, but full participation in it, not transcendence of the human condition, but profound acceptance of it, not the end of problems, but the end of creating unnecessary suffering through resistance to reality. And perhaps most important, the discovery that you are not broken, you are not failing, you are not uniquely deficient. You are simply human, caught in patterns that all humans share, suffering in ways that all humans suffer. But suffering with awareness is different from suffering in unconsciousness, and suffering that leads to awakening is not wasted suffering. Every moment you have spent imprisoned in compulsive thinking has brought you to this moment, reading these words, touching this possibility of freedom. Nothing was wasted. The prison was necessary. The addiction served its purpose. But that purpose is complete now. It is time to walk out of the cell. The door is open. It was always open. You just did not know where to look. So here is my final question for you. Not to think about, but to feel into, to let resonate in the silence after these words end. What would your life be like if you were actually here for it? Not lost in thought, not managing the past or controlling the future, but here, now, fully present for this miraculous, fleeting, irreplaceable moment that is your life. You will never know until you try, until you practice, until you take the risk of letting go, even for a moment, of the false security that compulsive thinking promises. And when you do, when you finally allow yourself to be still, to be present, to simply be, you will discover what mystics and meditators have known for millennia. The freedom you seek is not in the future. It is not dependent on circumstances. It is not earned through achievement or granted through grace. It is here. It was always here. You just had to stop thinking long enough to notice. Welcome home. May you wake from the sleep of the mind. May you discover the freedom that was always yours. May you live the life you are actually living, not the one you are thinking about. This is Echoes of the Ancients, reminding you the ancient wisdom is not in the past. It is in the eternal present, waiting for you to arrive.